Hey there, and welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. Tonight, as the world outside settles into its quiet rhythm, we embark on a journey not of grand battles and shining armor, but of the unvarnished reality beneath the gleam. We'll delve into the true, often grueling existence of a medieval knight tracing his path from a tender age to eventual obsolescence. Before we fully embark on tonight's journey through these cold stone halls and muddy fields, a simple gesture can help us continue these explorations. If you genuinely find peace and insight in what we do here, a quiet subscribe and a little like mean a lot. And we always appreciate a brief note in the comments sharing where you're listening from, perhaps a quiet thought on how different life was back then. Now dim the lights, find your most comfortable position, and let your mind gently drift back, not to the heroic tales, but to the everyday grind of a life forged in steel and duty. Imagine yourself a child of 7 in a world far removed from the soft comforts you know. No brightly colored toys, no carefully curated playdates, and certainly no gentle goodbyes filled with promises of return. Your parents, perhaps a lesser noble or a knight of modest means, stand tall, their faces etched with a blend of pride and an unspoken sorrow. This is not a choice, you see. This is duty. You are to be sent away to begin the long, arduous path toward knighthood, becoming a page in a distant lord's castle. Your small, still-growing frame is likely already accustomed to a certain amount of physical labor, but nothing truly prepares you for the weight of expectation that settles on your shoulders. There's no ink, no keepsakes, just a small bundle of worn clothes and a quiet pat on the head, perhaps a mumbled prayer. Readiness is simply not a consideration. You are 7. You are male. You are therefore ready for whatever this harsh new world throws at you. The castle gates creak open, vast and imposing, promising both the potential for greatness and an undeniable certainty of hardship. It's a world that has little use for childhood, where innocence is shed quickly like an unnecessary cloak in a gale. From the very first sliver of dawn, long before the sun even contemplates touching the highest turrets, your life becomes an endless litany of chores and physical drudgery. This is not the glamorous life of a future warrior, but the back-breaking routine of an invisible servant. You spend your days constantly running errands, your small legs aching as you sweep vast, drafty halls, deliver messages to stern-faced knights, or assist with the preparation of meals in a bustling, often chaotic kitchen. The sheer scale of everything is exhausting. The halls are vast, the stone cold, and the air perpetually damp. And then there's the glamour of armor polishing. Imagine taking heavy iron boots, stiff with dried mud caked with horse dung, and painstakingly scraping and buffing them until they gleam, or at least until they no longer offend your master's sensibilities. Your hands are perpetually blistered. Your back, a constant dull ache. You are, for the most part, unseen, a shadow flitting through the castle performing the thankless labor that underpins the magnificent facade of knighthood. No one offers praise. No one offers comfort. There is only the endless demanding routine reinforcing the harsh truth your identity for now is defined by your utility. You are simply another pair of small, overworked hands in a vast, self-sufficient ecosystem. Beyond the ceaseless chores, the truly brutal part of your new life begins with training. From the moment you can competently wield a wooden stick, you are thrown into early combat. Imagine small, uncoordinated bodies clad in rough tunics, clashing with blunted wooden swords. These aren't playful duels. They are lessons in impact and balance, in the stark reality of what is to come. Every day brings new bruises, a rainbow of purples and greens blossoming across your small limbs. Your muscles ache in places you didn't know existed, and the taste of dust and exertion becomes intimately familiar. The objective is not victory, but endurance. You learn to absorb a blow to keep your feet, and to keep fighting even when your arms feel like lead. One particularly prevalent lesson repeated with soul-crushing frequency is the art of falling. Not falling gracefully, mind you, but falling in a way that minimizes catastrophic injury. You are taught to dismount from a pony, then a horse, then a larger horse, sometimes at a canter, sometimes from a dead stop. This isn't about elegant horsemanship. It's about preparation for being unseated in battle for hitting the unforgiving ground without breaking your neck. You fall again and again, the impact jarring your teeth, rattling your bones, knocking the wind from your lungs. It often feels like falling, rather than fighting, is the primary lesson of your youth. Your body quickly develops a profound instinctual respect for hard surfaces and a grudging acceptance of pain as a constant companion. Because in this world, weakness is not tolerated. Pain is not to be displayed, not to be acknowledged. You learn to swallow it, to grit your teeth, to push through the throbbing in your head or the searing ache in your leg. Crying is met with scolding, often with a backhand. Displaying vulnerability is a luxury you cannot afford. This suppression of natural human reaction drills into you an almost unnerving stoicism, an early lesson in detachment that will serve you well or perhaps simply ensure you break quietly. Beyond the physical, there is the brutal discipline of absolute obedience. You are to speak only when spoken to, and then only with a quiet, respectful tone. You bow deeply to any superior, whether they are a seasoned knight or a slightly older squire. Questioning commands, no matter how trivial, nonsensical, or humiliating, is simply not an option. Your role is to comply instantly and without complaint. This isn't merely about good manners. It's about forging the kind of unquestioning loyalty and immediate reaction that could save a life or take one on a battlefield. Mistakes are met with swift, often unpleasant physical corrections. The back of a hand across the ear is common. Forgetting a task or performing it poorly might earn you extended unpleasant chores, such as scrubbing the Lord's chamber pot, a truly humbling experience that leaves no doubt about your place in the hierarchy. You might find yourself enduring public humiliation, a boy kneeling for 2 days straight in the perpetually cold castle chapel forehead pressed to the stone floor simply for forgetting to remove his cap in the presence of the Lord. These aren't gentle reminders. They are stark lessons designed to instill fear and conformity, ensuring that the hierarchy is respected down to its last most insignificant detail. The message is clear. Your existence is defined by service, and your will is secondary to the will of your superiors. Every hour is a test, every moment a lesson in conformity. While the castle endlessly drilled your body and spirit into submission, your intellectual education for the most part was considered secondary, shall we say, literacy. The ability to read and write was a true luxury reserved primarily for the sons of exceptionally wealthy families who could afford tutors or for those destined for a career within the church. If your family had the coin, perhaps you might spend an hour or two with a solemn-faced cleric, painstakingly learning to form letters on a rare piece of parchment, or slowly deciphering Latin phrases from a heavy illuminated manuscript. This Latin, you'd find, was mostly for understanding church services, or perhaps reading the grand, often exaggerated epitaphs on tombs. It was not for most a tool for widespread communication or personal enrichment. For the vast majority of people, and certainly for the average page, the pen was far less mighty than the sword, and demonstrably less useful than a strong back. True learning for you was far more pragmatic, a process of constant acute observation and imitation. You learned by listening, absorbing every command, every snippet of conversation, every story told by the firelight. You memorized prayers often without fully grasping their meaning, but understanding their rhythm and purpose. And on those truly rare occasions when a scrap of parchment or a worn tablet might be available, you'd practice shaky-handed copying your fingers, cramped your eyes, straining in the dim, smoky light. It was a laborious process, a testament to the sheer effort required to put thoughts to paper in a world where such materials were precious and ink was a luxury item derived from soot and gall nuts. Compare that for a moment to the ease with which words now flow from your fingertips onto a screen. A medieval page would consider your simplest email a miracle of almost divine proportions. The priorities in the medieval castle were clear-etched, not in parchment, but in sweat and calluses. Muscle and unyielding obedience were valued above all else. Your ability to wield a wooden sword, to endure long hours of drills, to instantly respond to a command. These were the skills that marked your progression. Academic pursuits. The realm of monks and scholars were seen as largely irrelevant, perhaps even effeminate for a future knight. Your strength was meant to be in your arm, in your loyalty, in your capacity for enduring hardship, not in your intellectual prowess. A knight was a doer, a protector, an enforcer, not a philosopher, or at least not usually. Yet this life of constant observation instilled in you a different kind of education. Courtly observation, the subtle art of navigating the intricate social labyrinth of the castle. You'd learn, for instance, which fork to use, a largely theoretical lesson, as fingers were still the preferred and often more effective utensils for a good chunk of meat. You'd quietly observe the absurd rituals of noble dining, understanding that sometimes a polite burp was less offensive than a clumsy spill. More importantly, you mastered the painful art of standing still for hours on end, balancing heavy platters during elaborate feasts, your small muscles screaming in protest while pretending not to exist. The challenge was not simply in the weight, but in maintaining an impassive face, ignoring the rich aromas of roasting meats that your perpetually hungry stomach longed for. But perhaps the most vital survival skill you acquired was the art of invisibility. You learned to melt into the shadows during noble temper flares, when the Lord's face would redden and his voice would boom, often accompanied by the sudden crash of a tankard. You quickly discerned which drunken boasts were harmless bluster and which might escalate into genuine danger. You became an expert at reading the subtle shifts in atmosphere, at sensing tension before it broke and positioning yourself out of the line of fire. These were not lessons taught by tutors, but by instinct, honed by the sharp edge of fear. The castle, you discovered, was a place of constant drama, where human passions flared, and your best defense was to be a silent, unmoving observer, absorbing the raw realities of power, anger, and fleeting joy from the very edges of the room. This quiet observation, you would find, taught you more about the world than any book ever could. The daily hardships were a constant, a dull ache beneath the surface of every task. Mornings began invariably with Mass held in the perpetually cold castle chapel. Imagine the biting chill, a polite couple of degrees above freezing, seeping into your very bones as you knelt on the hard, unyielding stone floor. Your breath fogged visibly in the air, a fleeting testament to the cold that seemed to cling to every corner of the ancient edifice. The constant struggle was simply to stay awake, to resist the insidious lure of sleep, your small body craving the warmth of your straw pallet. your mind drifting through the Latin murmurs of the priest. This wasn't merely a religious obligation. It was an early lesson in endurance in performing duty, even when your body screamed for comfort. Faith, you were told, was not just a moral compass, but a form of training. You were constantly reminded of your divine purpose, your holy duty. Regular confession was encouraged, a cleansing of the soul, though sometimes it felt more like a cleansing of guilt for wishing you had more bread. Prayers were recited not just for salvation, but mostly and quite pragmatically for good health, for a lack of disease. Because in an age devoid of modern medicine, a bad cough could become a death sentence. A simple cut could fester into a limb-threatening infection. You prayed not to get sick, for remedies were few, and the castle physician, if one was even present, relied more on superstition and bloodletting than on genuine healing. Meals, when they came, were brief, unappetizing affairs. Imagine gnawing on a dry crust of bread, perhaps a sliver of hard salted cheese. If you were truly lucky, there might be a small portion of tough cured meat. Vegetables, surprisingly to our modern palates, were often avoided. The common belief of the time was that they caused illness, leading to a dietary reliance on heavily salted and preserved meats, and that eternal unyielding dry crust. Imagine the craving for something fresh, something crisp, a simple apple perhaps, or a handful of berries that rarely, if ever, materialized on your plate. Rare feasts, however, were remembered for years. These were fleeting dreams, moments of almost unbelievable indulgence. A roasted pig, its skin crackling, or honeyed oatcakes, sweet and rich, would appear on the high table. You, of course, would likely be serving your stomach rumbling in protest, but the memory of the sight, the aroma, was enough to sustain you through weeks of dry crusts and hard cheese. These were the vivid culinary milestones in a life largely defined by scarcity. When it finally came, sleep was far from restorative. You'd find yourself on a straw pallet, probably in the servants' quarters, shoulder to shoulder with other pages and squires, the air thick with the smell of sweat, damp earth, and mildew. No memory foam, no Egyptian cotton sheets here. This was simply a place to fall exhausted into a restless slumber, your body aching from the day's toil. And even this meager rest was often interrupted. You might be pulled from sleep for the late arrival of a lord or an important guest needing someone to attend to their horse, their luggage, their every whim. These early lessons in rising without complaint, in working through profound exhaustion, instilled a resilience that bordered on the superhuman. You learned to function on fumes, to operate with a kind of automatic efficiency that bypassed the body's natural need for rest. You became, in essence, a tireless machine fueled by duty and the desperate hope for a few uninterrupted hours of oblivion. Amidst the grinding routine and the ever-present ache, moments of fleeting relief, like small sunlit patches on a cloudy day, would occasionally break through. You weren't alone in your suffering, and in the shared experience, silent friendships would often form. Knowing glances would pass between fellow pages, a mutual understanding of a difficult task, a shared eye roll at a particularly pompous night. There were whispered complaints muttered beneath your breath, or in the deepest shadows shared only with those who understood the particular miseries of a page's life. These unspoken bonds, forged in the crucible of communal hardship, were often your only solace, a quiet solidarity that affirmed you were not the only one enduring this particular purgatory. Navigating the castle hierarchy became an art form, a subtle dance of observation and avoidance. You learned quickly which knights were cruel, quick to anger, and best given a wide berth. You discerned which were lenient, perhaps even occasionally kind, and where in the sprawling castle you might find a brief moment of peace, a quiet corner to catch your breath, or perhaps even a few moments of solitude away from the watchful eyes of the steward. These small mercies were treasures, a cook's rough but genuine jest, a clumsy knight's spectacular stumble, which, though you dared not laugh aloud, provided an internal burst of mirth or a stolen apple crisp and sweet, a forbidden delight that offered a brief, tangible reminder of life beyond endless duty. Sometimes the outside world would intrude upon the castle walls, bringing with it tantalizing glimpses of a different existence. Merchants would arrive, their carts laden with exotic goods and their mouths full of tales from distant lands. Traveling performers might set up in the courtyard their colorful costumes and captivating tricks, a stark contrast to the drab, demanding routine. Noble women adorned in silks and jewels would arrive with their own retinues, their laughter and refined conversations hinting at a world of leisure and beauty. These fleeting glimpses, like sparks in the darkness, often stirred a foreign hope for the future within you, a vague yearning for something beyond the castle walls, something more than chores and bruises. Yet beneath it all, a gnawing uncertainty persisted. The distant glory of knighthood, of grand deeds and gleaming armor, was a powerful if elusive ideal, but it constantly battled with the grinding reality of aching limbs, constant scoldings, and persistent hunger. You were sustained by that image of a knight, a figure of strength and honor gleaming in the sunlight. But you knew with every bruise and every empty stomach that the path to it was paved with the unglamorous, the uncomfortable, and the often humiliating. The reality of a page's life was a constant contradiction, a testament to the fact that even the most noble aspirations are built on a foundation of grit and grime. You were also, by virtue of your role, a silent witness to the castle's official ceremonies and boisterous festivals. Attending ceremonies meant being background noise, a small, still figure amidst the richly dressed nobles, constantly reminded of your invisible status. When dignitaries arrived, you were part of the meticulous preparation, helping ready guest rooms, polishing the family silver, until your arm ached and sweeping the same halls repetitively, making sure every speck of dust was gone. Any mishap, any small imperfection, and the pages would bear the blame, a harsh lesson in accountability, even when the fault wasn't truly yours. This environment, however, subtly refined your practical intelligence. You mastered the art of evasion, the skill of looking intensely busy while being nowhere near a problem, especially when a mischievous dog might have, for instance, decided to relieve itself on a visiting bishop's expensive robes. You learned to read expressions to anticipate trouble and to disappear with a practiced ease. During festivals, you'd observe the music, the dancing, the drunken revelry from the corners of the great hall, occasionally receiving a small, unexpected treat, a piece of candied fruit perhaps, or a bite of roasted meat, a rare indulgence. Some pages, seeking escape from the monotony, found solace in the castle's rare illuminated manuscripts, poring over ancient texts, listening intently to stories of Roman generals or the lives of saints, their imaginations briefly soaring beyond the stone walls. And then there were the hushed warnings from older servants, tales of failed pages of boys who simply vanished, deemed unfit or unworthy. These whispers reinforced the necessity of discretion, of never drawing undue attention, of blending in and performing your duties without complaint. The castle in every hour was a crucible. It was forging a harder, leaner, more capable creature out of the child you once were. You were no longer a child, certainly, but you were not yet a knight. You were merely becoming. Then came the promotion to squire, usually around the age of 14. This was marked by a small, solemn ceremony, a brief acknowledgement of your transition, but it promised no kindness, only more bruises and fewer comforts. The new title, Squire, echoed with a false sense of grandeur, obscuring the truth you were now expected to do: more endure more and hurt more. Your duties escalated dramatically. No longer were you merely polishing floors. Now you were polishing intricate armor. No longer just fetching goblets. Now you were tending to your knight's every need, often in circumstances where his very life or yours hung in the balance. The most significant change was your intimate servitude. You were now directly assigned to a specific knight, expected to serve him like a shadow, anticipating his every need, his every command. This extended to the most dangerous of places you would follow him into battle, risking your own life to assist a fallen master, to rescue him from the fray, or to simply ensure his survival. This wasn't merely about personal service. It was about absolute loyalty and the very real possibility of dying for another man. It was a relationship built on trust and necessity, where your life was often contingent upon his. The physical demands intensified exponentially. You were no longer just learning to ride. You were wrestling enormous temperamental war horses, beasts bred for strength, speed, and raw power, not elegance. Mounting one of these massive animals was a battle in itself, a constant negotiation between your will and its raw strength, a struggle that left your thighs aching and your spine jarred. You learned to control them not through gentle reins, but through sheer force of will and the development of powerful, unyielding leg muscles. These were not the noble steeds of legend, but powerful, often unpredictable engines of war. And then there was live blade training. Wooden swords were a thing of the past. Now you wielded sharp, though blunted swords daily. The blunting was a mere formality. They were still heavy, still capable of delivering bone-jarring blows. Your body became perpetually covered in a fresh tapestry of bruises, each one a testament to a missed block, a clumsy parry, a moment of lapsed concentration. The lessons were brutal, unforgiving. The knight training you didn't expect grace or finesse. He expected tenacity, endurance, and an unyielding will to keep fighting even when every muscle screamed in protest. The burden of equipment care became an obsession. The armor you quickly discovered was less a gleaming symbol and more a complex, multi-layered ecosystem of grime, sweat, and occasionally, due to damp storage conditions, slugs. Your meticulous maintenance became critical. Every hinge, every strap, every plate had to be cleaned, polished, inspected. A single rusted rivet, a dented chest plate, a fraying buckle. These were not minor oversights. They could spell disaster in battle, a fatal flaw that could cost your knight his life. And that, of course, would be your fault. The implied death wish, that your negligence could lead to your master's demise, hung over you like a perpetual storm cloud. Your reputation and indeed your continued existence depended on absolute precision. Weapon readiness was equally vital. Daily sharpening of swords, ensuring their edge was keen enough to cleave, but not so thin it would chip on bone. Testing lances, examining shields. The knight's life and your very future depended on the absolute readiness of every piece of his formidable arsenal. You learned to distinguish the subtle imperfections, the telltale signs of wear that could mean the difference between victory and catastrophe. This was not merely maintenance. It was a ritual of survival, a constant vigil against the inevitable forces of rust, decay, and violent impact. Your new role as a squire stripped away the romantic veil from tournaments, transforming them from the page's colorful dream into a brutal, bone-breaking reality. As a young boy, you might have imagined dazzling displays of skill and chivalry, a vibrant spectacle of heroic knights. Now you saw them for what they truly were: controlled violence, a proving ground where blunt swords still broke bones and where the threat of serious injury was very real. You were no longer a wide-eyed observer. You were a key part of the unseen labor that made these spectacles possible. Your tasks during a tournament were endless and unglamorous. You would be saddling enormous war horses, their powerful flanks rippling under your hand, making sure every strap was secure, every buckle tightened. You carried heavy lances, their tips blunted but still unwieldy, running them to your knight as he prepared for a charge. And then there was the blood. You would discreetly wipe blood from your knight's face between passes, making sure he looked presentable for the cheering crowds, even if his nose was broken or his lip split. The public facade of glory was meticulously maintained thanks to the tireless, often messy work of squires like you. The outcome of these contests, whether victory or defeat, had very tangible consequences for your knight and by extension for you. If your knight won, you would be tasked with collecting the prize money, a welcome if often meager sum. But if he lost, your duties shifted to tending his broken ribs, his bruised dignity. You would assist him off the field, help him out of his dented armor, and listen to his curses as he assessed the damage. The glamour quickly vanished, replaced by the grim reality of pain and the cost of glory. The tournament, you learned, was a harsh master, and its lessons were often written in aches and scrapes. Yet these staged contests paled in comparison to the unromantic face of real war. A campaign was not a glorious ride across verdant fields. It was an arduous march through endless mud under a ceaseless rain, or beneath a scorching sun, the air thick with the smell of unwashed men and uncleaned horses. Days and weeks would stretch out each one, bringing new levels of physical discomfort and profound uncertainty. Food and sleep, which were already scarce commodities in the castle, became truly rare luxuries on campaign. You learned to snatch moments of rest where you could, often on cold, damp ground, your head resting on your pack, your sword still within reach. Your body, already hardened by years of training, would discover new dimensions of pain. Armor, which was merely heavy in training, now chafed in previously unknown and excruciating places. Every step brought a new rub, a new pinch, a constant irritation that wore down your patience and your resolve. Profound exhaustion became your default state. Your limbs would move solely out of necessity, driven by an almost primal instinct for survival rather than any conscious will. You became a zombie of duty, barely registering the landscape, focused only on the next step, the next command, the next moment of relative safety. And then there was battle itself. It was not the organized, heroic clash of your dreams. It was a cacophony of screams, the ringing clang of metal on metal, the shrieking of terrified horses, and the desperate guttural orders of commanders lost in the wind. The stench of blood, sweat, and fear filled the air, thick and nauseating. The sudden absolute silence of a dying man collapsing to the ground just inches from you would pierce through the chaos, a stark reminder of the fragile thread of life. Fear became a constant companion, but you learned to manage it, to distinguish between the fear that paralyzed and the fear that sharpened your senses, focusing your will, making you deadly efficient. The battlefield was a terrifying, visceral tutor, teaching lessons far more brutal than any squire's master ever could. In the maelstrom of battle, the greatest peril for a knight was falling. To be unhorsed meant instant, terrifying vulnerability. Imagine losing your footing on slick, churned mud, your visor jarring loose, the world reduced to a dizzying blur of hooves, blades, and shouting. You'd flail, you'd crawl, you'd pray, Your heavy armor didn't trap you like a turtle on its back, a helpless target for any passing enemy. In that moment, a squire's role wasn't just critical. It was the difference between life and a brutal, ignominious end. The need for your squire to pull you free to help you regain your feet or drag you to safety across a muddy, arrow-ridden field was paramount. It was a back-breaking, unheroic task often performed under a hail of projectiles, but it was often the only alternative to being forgotten, trampled, or simply finished. Amidst this terrifying struggle, you'd catch fleeting, horrific glimpses of the carnage around you. Unhorsed knights struggling in their heavy plate. Impaled peasants, their brief lives brutally cut short. Falling banners, symbols of unit and purpose collapsing into the chaos. Friends vanishing in an instant, swallowed by the swirling melee, their screams unheard amidst the general din. The battle lines dissolved quickly into confusion, orders becoming meaningless whispers in the storm. Enemies were mistaken for allies in the swirling dust and smoke, and the battlefield was reduced to a storm of survival, a primal individual struggle against overwhelming odds. When the battle finally subsided, there was rarely triumph, only profound exhaustion. Your arms would ache with a deep, bone-weary fatigue. Your ears would ring with the echoes of screams and clanging steel, and your horse, if it had survived, would tremble beneath you as shaken as you were. The first thing you'd do with shaking hands was strip off your armor, hoping the bloodied gloves weren't your own, praying the grim reality of battle hadn't claimed another piece of you. Then came the grim task of walking the field. Crows would already be gathering their dark forms, circling above the fallen. The wounded would groan their cries, piercing the newfound silence. This was the unromantic reality of medieval warfare, the task of helping some offering what meager comfort you could, and for others, the grim necessity of finishing their suffering a mercy in a world with no field hospitals. Looters both from your own side and the enemy's would move silently through the aftermath, stripping the dead of anything of value. It was a dishonorable act, perhaps, but a practical necessity in a costly war where every piece of equipment, every scrap of metal was precious. Sitting by dying fires in the flickering, uncertain light, you and your comrades would clean wounds often your own and stare blankly into space. There was no boasting, no celebratory drinking, no loud pronouncements of victory, only a quiet shared understanding of the cost. You'd tally the losses, the men who wouldn't return the captured banners, the horses that needed to be replaced, the squires who had not made it. The reality of war was etched not in glory, but in absence. Upon your ascension to knighthood, the vigil and the dubbing ceremony were often portrayed as moments of sublime glory. In reality, they were often another ordeal, a final test of endurance. The purifying night meant for prayer and deep reflection was spent in a small, cold chamber, often with nothing but a scratchy wool blanket to ward off the chill. Your bones would ache from the hard stone floor, your stomach would rumble with hunger from the required fasting. This was not glamour. It was a physical and spiritual challenge, a test of your resolve more than your piety. The true test of the vigil often lay not in meditating on sacred duties, but in the internal battle against the craving for a sip of water, a brief moment of rest. Rumors persisted whispered among squires of boys vomiting from sheer nerves during this supposedly holy night. The dubbing itself was a more public affair. You would be escorted to a transformed main hall, perhaps strewn with fresh rushes and hung with banners, where you would kneel before your lord or king. This was the moment of formal recognition. A ceremonial sword would tap your shoulders right then left. Sometimes, especially in older traditions, there would be a symbolic slap, a final physical test of your stoicism. This was to remind you, even at your moment of triumph, that humility and resilience were still paramount. You would then rise as a knight, a subtle internal shift noted by quiet nods from your peers and a tight-lipped approving smile from your lord. If your new status afforded it, a feast would follow, offering you a higher seat at the table, a finer cup, perhaps even a taste of wine previously reserved for the nobility. Yet for many, the reality of knighting was far less ceremonial, often improvised on a battlefield. Amidst the carnage, the mud and the screams, a wounded commander might tap a bloodied sword on your shoulder, conferring the title in a desperate moment of need, an acknowledgement of courage, a brutal induction into the ranks of the armored elite. There was no purification, no vigil, no feast, just the grim, immediate expectation of continued service and further bloodshed. This was the true face of knighthood for many a title earned in the very thick of the violence it symbolized. With your new title came an immediate and overwhelming expansion of responsibilities. No longer were you merely a follower. You were now expected to lead men to make decisions and to ride at the front of the charge. This was a profound psychological shift. Your accountability widened immensely. A knight's word was binding, his signature carried weight. His absence at court was noted, and his presence in church was assumed. Every action you took, every word you uttered was now subject to public scrutiny. Deep drinking or loose talk at a tavern no longer reflected just on you. It reflected on your entire household, your banner, and by extension, your liege lord. A slip of the tongue could sour alliances, a drunken scuffle could undo weeks of careful diplomacy. The margin for error, you discovered, had shrunk to almost nothing. Every action was public, every misstep potentially costly. The most immediate physical challenge was adapting to the armored life itself. Your first lesson, often learned painfully, was simply how to walk, breathe, and move effectively within 60-plus pounds of steel. It was less like wearing clothing and more like inhabiting a second rigid skin. Chain mail, the common armor of the time, was an iron tunic composed of thousands of tiny interlinked rings. It clung to your body, dragged with its immense weight, and caught every drop of sweat worn over a foul-smelling, abrasive padded gambeson that protected your skin, but often caused chafing and rashes. As armor evolved from simple breastplates to full-plate enclosure, each piece was meticulously designed for protection, but still prone to pinching, to restricting movement in unexpected ways. And the helmet. Ah, the helmet. Its muffled sound narrowed your vision to a terrifyingly small slit, steamed up with every breath, and caused persistent throbbing headaches. It was a protective shield in battle. Yes, a vital barrier against deadly blows. But outside of combat, it was a source of constant discomfort, a suffocating, disorienting cage that you were now expected to wear for hours on end. Despite the sheer weight of armor, and perhaps surprisingly to a modern observer, the fully armored knight possessed a remarkable, if effortful, range of motion. You could run, you could squat, you could mount a horse, even roll on the ground if unhorsed. But every single movement required immense effort, a profound expenditure of energy. This fostered a new kind of movement, deliberate and conserved, where every step, every swing, every shift of weight was calculated to maximize efficiency and minimize the drain on your strength. It wasn't about graceful leaps. It was about the heavy, purposeful movements of a human tank designed to absorb and deliver punishment. The unending cycle of equipment maintenance, which had been your squire's duty, now became your ultimate responsibility. Your armor was not a static object. It was a vulnerable system, a complex puzzle of steel, leather, and rivets. Every single piece needed constant cleaning, oiling, and inspection. A single rusted rivet, a tiny dent in a chest plate, a worn strap. Any one of these could spell disaster in the heat of battle. You were effectively a blacksmith's apprentice now, working late into the night, often with your squire, to maintain your gear. Any oversight, any piece of rust missed by your squire would be painfully and immediately noticed, usually by a broken piece of gear at the worst possible moment. Weapon care was equally meticulous. Your swords were primarily designed for hacking and cleaving, not for the elegant fencing of later eras. They needed to be kept sharp enough to inflict devastating wounds, but not so razor-thin that they would chip or break on bone or armor. Lances, those unwieldy battering rams of the mounted charge, had to be checked for splinters and cracks, lest they shatter prematurely. Maces with their blunt, crushing heads were designed for brutal helmet cave-ins, and their efficacy depended on raw power. Axes, the close-quarter specialists, needed to be impeccably balanced. These were not tools of precision, but of brute force designed to inflict maximum damage. And then there were the shields. More than just defensive implements, they bore your personal coat of arms, a visible declaration of your identity and allegiance. But their primary function was visceral. They were used for punching, for deflecting blows, for absorbing the bone-jarring force of an enemy's strike. A good shield could save your life. A bad one, or one poorly maintained, could become your coffin, failing at the critical moment. Each piece of equipment was a silent testament to the constant dance between maintenance and the brutality of combat. Your first formal ride as a newly dubbed knight was a moment of profound personal identity. You would ride at the head of your retinue, perhaps through the village that owed fealty to your lord, your new banner snapping proudly in the wind. You'd observe the children running alongside their faces, alight with awe and wonder. The old men bowing respectfully, perhaps a woman tossing a wild flower in your path. In that moment, you would begin to grasp the reality of your new status. This attention was a form of applause, an acknowledgement of your transformation, your new place in the world. Later, in the quiet of your own chamber, perhaps as you slowly removed your armor piece by laborious piece, you would find yourself contemplating your reflection. You would see what others saw: a protector, a leader, a formidable figure. But you wouldn't yet fully believe it. The internal shift was still underway, a fragile seed of self-belief struggling to take root amidst years of disciplined obedience. Your body, already accustomed to the rigors, would continue its training, its daily regimen of prayer and physical exertion. You would still limp from old aches, still feel the phantom pains of past bruises, but now, crucially, you would be consulted rather than commanded. Younger squires, the new generation of pages, would look on with a mixture of awe and fear, seeing in you the idealized vision of what they might become. And as the inevitable whispers of war began to circulate, as the talk turned to borders and rivalries and grievances, you would begin to understand the true weight of your new position. You would be in the vanguard, leading the charge, placing yourself at the forefront of the deadliest exchanges. You would confront the potential cost of your new accolade, understanding that the honor you had just received might demand your very life in return. The shining ideal of knighthood, you realized, was inextricably linked to the grim reality of ultimate sacrifice. The new knight also quickly understood the brutal truth of life's most profound losses. You had, as a squire, often seen and perhaps even helped bury comrades. Other squires' boys who had almost made it trampled under hoof or lanced in a skirmish. But now, as a knight, the loss felt heavier, the responsibility more acute. There were no songs or poems for those who almost made it, no grand narratives for the anonymous fallen. Just the quiet, harrowing task of carrying grief, learning to suppress your sorrow, to push it down and continue working, even as the world around you shifted, even as a familiar face vanished from the ranks. It was a lesson in emotional resilience, in hardening your heart, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. The work, the duty always continued regardless of loss. Your knight, your former master, would continue to be a teacher, but his lessons now extended far beyond mere battle. He would instruct you in character judgment and how to read a battlefield, not just the terrain, but the morale of men, the subtle shifts in enemy formations. He would impart the nuances of leadership, the delicate balance of inspiring courage while demanding discipline. And crucially, he would teach you the critical skill of knowing when to speak, and perhaps more importantly, when to remain silent. These were not lessons found in manuals, but gleaned from years of hard-won experience, subtle wisdom passed down from one generation of battle-hardened men to the next. The cold reality of medieval life, too, never truly receded. Winter in particular brought its own distinct miseries: cracked fingers from the icy wind, the painful chill of armor that felt as if it had absorbed the very frost from the air. There was no room for complaint, no opportunity for warmth unless it was from a roaring hearth in a brief respite. You learned to live with the chill, to ignore the discomfort, another small test of your now ingrained resilience. Despite the constant demands and the gruff exterior, a new knight would occasionally begin to find his own voice, to engage in personal reflection, however clumsy. Perhaps one evening you would attempt to write your first letter home to your parents. It would be a stiff, clumsy, formal note, undoubtedly filled with generic reassurances and devoid of any true personal feeling. But the act of writing it, of putting pen to parchment, would serve as an act of self-anchoring, a rare connection to the world you had left behind, a quiet confirmation of your existence to those who might only have vague news of your progress. You would also begin to listen more intently to the veterans, to the older knights who carried their own heavy burdens of experience. The knight's own tales of campaign hardships, of fallen comrades, would be absorbed, remembered, woven into the tapestry of your own burgeoning understanding of warfare. These were not the embellished sagas of the minstrels, but the raw, unvarnished recollections of men who had seen the worst of humanity and somehow endured. You learned to pick out the details, the specific strategies, the small moments of fear or heroism that made the stories real. In the solitude of practice, perhaps late at night in the deserted training yard, you would find yourself mimicking, secretly practicing the knight's stance, his precise footwork, the way he held his blade, the subtle twist of his wrist in a parry. You would bleed and limp in the process, each mistake a silent teacher, each bruise a reminder of the chasm between intention and mastery. This self-directed training, often performed in secret, was a testament to your unyielding drive, your personal commitment to embodying the ideal. And then, one day, the final summons would come. You would ride with your knight no longer as an observer, no longer as a servant, but as his second. You would be his shadow no more, but his equal, embodying a readiness forged through years of relentless endurance, of pain absorbed, of lessons learned in the harshest possible school. You were no longer becoming. You were here. The transition from squire to knight, though celebrated, brought an immediate and profound shift in your role on the battlefield. The years of training, the countless hours of practice, the physical conditioning, all of it felt suddenly inadequate when confronted with the raw, terrifying reality of actual war. Nothing you quickly discovered truly prepares you for the trumpet's shrill, piercing sound, the restless shifting of your powerful warhorse beneath you, or the sight of the enemy line arrayed directly ahead, banners snapping, weapons glinting in the uncertain light. The battlefield itself was not a stage for heroics, nor a chessboard for strategic genius. It was a living, breathing chaos, a pulsing, groaning entity of churned mud, spilled blood, and clanging metal. It was a place where all the whispered ideals of chivalry, of honor, of fair play, which had been so carefully recited in chapels and praised by poets, held absolutely no sway. On the field, survival trumped virtue. Instinct superseded code, and the only rule that truly mattered was to kill or be killed. The arduous march to conflict was a narrative of suffering in itself. Days and weeks of travel through relentless rain that soaked you to the bone under a scorching sun that blistered your skin, or through the bone-chilling cold of winter. The air around the army grew foul thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, horse dung, and rotting rations. Your feet would become a map of blisters and sores, your temper would fray as sleep eluded you, and eventually you and your comrades would begin to smell indistinguishable from your horses, a testament to the shared grim reality of the campaign. Camp life offered little respite. Tents flapped incessantly in the wind, offering meager protection. Smoky fires provided a brief illusion of warmth but filled your lungs with acrid fumes. Food was scarce and unappetizing, a monotonous rotation of dried meat and hardtack. Water was often questionable, drunk with a silent prayer against dysentery. And always, always there was the ever-present vigilance. You slept with your boots on your sword within reach, your senses alert to every rustle, every distant cry, every sign of potential danger. Rest was not a right, but a gamble, a brief, uneasy truce with the constant threat of attack. Then came the moment of sighting the enemy. Perhaps cresting a ridge, the opposing army would stretch out before you, a vast, imposing mass, their banners snapping defiantly in the wind, their knights glinting in the distant sun. It was a sight that stole your breath and tightened your stomach into a hard, cold knot. Commanders might shout orders, their voices echoing across the field, but few truly heard them over the pounding of their own hearts, the surge of adrenaline, and the sudden overwhelming realization of what was to come. Pre-battle rituals, small and desperate, would take hold. You'd check your horse's girth for the 10th time, ensuring the saddle was secure, that nothing could give way at the critical moment. You'd offer a prayer, perhaps a quick one, to your patron saint, or simply pretend to a silent plea for survival in the face of impossible odds. And then for a brief, terrifying moment, you'd contemplate your own mortality, the raw, stark possibility that this charge might be your last. The charge itself was not the graceful cinematic spectacle often imagined. It was a thunderous, terrifying surge. Hooves would tear at the ground, churning earth into a muddy, flying spray. Lances would be lowered, forming a deadly, impenetrable wall. Every single heartbeat would become a countdown to impact, a visceral anticipation of the bone-shaking collision to come. In that final, terrifying moment before contact, your focus would narrow, your entire being fixed on a single desperate hope that the opposing knight would be slightly slower, slightly more afraid, slightly less skilled than you. It was a prayer whispered not to God, but to fate, a plea for just a fraction of an advantage in the chaos that was about to unfold. Then came the horrific climax of combat, the bone-shaking impact. It was a sudden absolute hit, or the terrifying sensation of being hit, a collision that reverberated through every fiber of your being. Lance's splintered bodies crumpled, and then came the desperate immediate struggle to rise to find your feet before you were trampled by your own comrades or the enemy's charge. The noise was unrelenting screams of pain, guttural shouts of men, the high-pitched shriek of wounded horses, the ceaseless metallic clang of steel on steel. It was a cacophony without rhythm, only violence, a soundscape designed to strip you of reason and replace it with primal instinct. Within this maelstrom, survival became a series of flashing instinctual moments. You would duck, block, parry, feeling the jarring shock of an axe strike against your shield, the vibration of a sword sliding off your armor. These were not heroics, not grand gestures, but a desperate singular focus on inches on millimeters, on the small miraculous acts of remaining upright, of keeping your head, of continuing to breathe. The mud clung to your boots, slick and treacherous. The blood of friend and foe alike slicked your gauntlets, and the very air tasted of iron and ash, a bitter cocktail of combat. And then there was the burden of killing. There were no clean victories in this brutal dance. You would find yourself looking into eyes, seeing the primal fear, feeling the last ragged breath of a dying man beneath your blade. There was no glory in this, no sense of triumph, just the cold, hard reality of taking a life, a visceral act that would haunt the quiet moments long after the battle ended. The weight of that moment, of that undeniable act, was a truth few bards would ever sing about. The peril of falling was ever present, a knight's greatest fear. To lose your footing, to have your horse go down, was to plunge into a terrifying, claustrophobic world. Your visor could jar loose, blinding you, or the world would become a disorienting blur of hooves and blades. You'd flail. You'd crawl your heavy armor, becoming a suffocating weight, trapping you like a helpless beetle on its back. The only hope was for your squire to be there to drag you free, a back-breaking, unheroic task performed under extreme duress. The alternative was to be forgotten, trampled, or simply finished off in the chaos. Glimpses of carnage would flash before your eyes, unhorsed knights struggling in their heavy plate, peasants caught in the crossfire impaled on lances, falling banners, symbols of unit and purpose collapsing into the chaos, friends vanishing in an instant, swallowed by the swirling melee. The battle lines would dissolve quickly, disintegrating into utter confusion. Orders became meaningless, lost in the din, and in the swirling dust and smoke, enemies could easily be mistaken for allies. The battlefield was reduced to a storm of survival, a primal individual struggle against overwhelming odds. The grim aftermath of battle offered no genuine respite, no true triumph. Your arms would ache with a deep, bone-weary fatigue, your ears would ring with phantom screams, and the incessant clang of steel, and your horse, if it had survived, would tremble beneath you as shaken as you were. The first thing you'd do with shaking hands was strip off your armor, hoping the bloodied gloves weren't your own, praying the grim reality of battle hadn't claimed another piece of you. Then came the grim task of walking the field. Crows would already be gathering their dark forms, circling above the fallen. The wounded would groan their cries, piercing the newfound silence. This was the unromantic reality of medieval warfare, the task of helping some, offering what meager comfort you could, and for others, the grim necessity of finishing their suffering, a mercy in a world with no field hospitals. Looters both from your own side and the enemy's would move silently through the aftermath, stripping the dead of anything of value. It was a dishonorable act, perhaps, but a practical necessity in a costly war where every piece of equipment, every scrap of metal was precious. Sitting by dying fires in the flickering, uncertain light, you and your comrades would clean wounds, often your own, and stare blankly into space. There was no boasting, no celebratory drinking, no loud pronouncements of victory, only a quiet shared understanding of the cost. You'd tally the losses, the men who wouldn't return the captured banners, the horses that needed to be replaced, the squires who had not made it. The reality of war was etched not in glory, but in absence. There was no true celebration after a battle, only the grim tallying of losses. Lost men, often nameless, and unmourned beyond their immediate company, who had simply vanished into the chaos. Captured banners a blow to pride and a tangible symbol of defeat. Horses precious and difficult to replace lost to injury or exhaustion. And perhaps most poignantly, the squires who didn't return boys who had held such promise, whose paths were cut brutally short before they could even grasp the knightly dream. These were the true metrics of victory, or perhaps simply of survival. The cleaned-up story, the one that would be sung by minstrels and recited by chroniclers, was a carefully constructed fiction. It spoke of glory, of valiant charges, of righteous triumph. The Lord, safe behind his castle walls, would deliver stirring speeches, parades would be held, and flowers might even be thrown by cheering crowds. This narrative was a stark, almost laughable contrast to the remembered smell of the field, the coppery tang of blood, the acrid scent of fear. The look in a dying man's eyes fixed on something beyond your comprehension. That you knew was the true legacy of battle, a truth forever etched in your mind, inaccessible to the adoring crowds. As a veteran knight, a part of you would forever remain on that nameless field. You would continue to ride, to meticulously polish your armor, to train new squires with the same demanding discipline you had endured. But you would forever carry the indelible memory of the slick swords, the fogging visor, the sudden brutal impact of collision, the chaotic roar of combat. You would give lessons in form, in stance, in strategy, in the precise angle of a parry, but you would never truly describe the sounds, the shaking hands, the visceral terror that gnawed at your soul. You would fear that new squires, hearing the full, unvarnished truth, might still desire. It might still seek that brutal baptism of fire drawn by the romanticized tales they'd heard. Instead, you'd emphasize the small details that save lives, the importance of keeping shields up, the critical need to watch your footing in the unpredictable terrain of battle, the meticulous necessity of checking every strap and buckle on your armor. Because in war it wasn't grand heroics, but meticulous preparation and a sharp, often ruthless instinct for survival that truly mattered. You understood that a knight's courage was often just a hair's breadth away from simple, desperate will to live. Peace, when it finally arrived, was a different kind of challenge for an idle weapon. A knight, a man trained for war, a human instrument of violence, found himself adrift without a conflict. Peace brought with it a different kind of rust, the rust of boredom, of purposelessness. And so a knight without a war to fight would seek out tournaments, seeing them as the next best thing, a controlled environment where the skills honed on the battlefield could still be tested, where glory of a sort could still be won. These tournaments, unlike real war, were staged battles. They were dressed in heraldry, in pomp, and in the promise of profit. They were a choreographed spectacle, a stark contrast to the raw, visceral chaos of actual combat. They were, in essence, celebrity factories, places where battle made legends, but tournaments made heroes for the masses, creating a public face for the knightly ideal. The underlying danger was still very real, of course. A tournament was as perilous as any battlefield, just better lit, better announced, and performed for a cheering crowd. Invitations to these tournaments were extended based on reputation. a knight's past triumphs, or simply the lord's coin, a calculated investment in a potential winner. Receiving one of these invitations meant bustling into towns already alive with excitement, adorned with high banners proclaiming the event, the air thick with anticipation, and the smell of roasting meat. Of course, entry fees were often steep, a significant outlay for any knight regardless of his wealth. You would arrive with your retinue, your loyal squire, your armor, painstakingly polished, your war horse, impeccably groomed, a small, formidable procession ready for the staged conflict. The grounds themselves were meticulously prepared. Wooden stands, hastily erected but surprisingly sturdy, would stretch around the lists already filling with eager spectators. Merchant stalls would line the perimeter, hawking everything from cheap trinkets to exotic spices, their cries adding to the festive din. Minstrels rehearsing their heroic ballads would pluck at their lutes, their music adding a layer of pageantry. Children, their voices shrill with excitement, would already be shouting the names of their favorite knights, their young minds captivated by the spectacle. But beneath all this fanfare, the underlying danger was undeniable. A tournament, for all its pomp and circumstance, remained as perilous as a battlefield, just better lit, and announced the risks just as real. The melee was often the grandest spectacle. Dozens of knights, sometimes on foot, sometimes horseback, would charge across an open field, a thunderous display of force and chaos. It simulated combat, mimicking the swirling melee of a true battle, but ideally without its deadly intent. The goals were clear: disarming opponents, unhorsing them, bludgeoning them into submission, but ideally without killing them, because corpses yielded no ransom. And ransom, you understood, was often the true prize, a way to recoup your investment and turn a profit. Entering the melee, your emblazoned shield held high, your heart would thud against your ribs. The horns would sound a raucous, visceral cry, and the crowd would roar a wave of sound that seemed to physically push you forward. You would plunge into the swirling fight, a controlled chaos where blunted blades still broke bones, where teeth are lost, and where pride is always on the line. It would end when few remained standing, or when the judges, perhaps deeming it undignified, called a halt. You would leave limping, perhaps exhilarated, certainly exhausted, or on a bad day unconscious, carried from the field by your squire and men. Your reputation, however, would be profoundly impacted. Growing fame if successful, feigned indifference, and discreet bruise checks if not. But the tournament's true crown jewel was the joust. This was the defining event, the moment of ultimate individual prowess. One knight, one lance, one pass, separated by a wooden tilt rail. The objective was simple, brutal: shatter your lance on your opponent's shield helm or chest for points leading invariably to dented helmets, cracked ribs, and occasionally death. The spectacle was immense. Your name announced by a herald, trumpets blaring, perhaps a lady tying a ribbon to your lance. Bows and salutes exchanged with your opponent. Then the flag dropped, and all the pageantry vanished. The world narrowed to the pounding of hooves, the blinding speed of the charge, and the unwavering tip of your lance. The impact, if it was a clean hit, echoed like thunder, splinters of wood exploding into the air, the crowd roaring. Or you might be the one thrown hitting the ground hard, a painful reminder of mud's lack of chivalry, a sudden jarring connection with the unforgiving earth. These were moments of stark truth, where all pretense evaporated, and skill and brute force were the only things that mattered. Victory in a joust, or indeed in any part of the tournament, offered tangible gains. There was, of course, the coin, a direct financial reward for your prowess. But more importantly, there was notice the attention of powerful lords scanning the lists for talent, for a formidable fighter who might be worth investing in, or for a man of rising fame who could be married into their family, potentially changing your fortunes overnight. Success could lead to invitations to larger, more prestigious tournaments, a path to even greater renown and wealth. A ladder slowly climbed one shattered lance at a time. Yet whispers of corruption and deceit were never far from the tournament circuit. Tales circulated of bribed marshals turning a blind eye to infractions of sabotaged armor designed to fail at a critical moment, or even more dangerously, of unblunted lances used to settle old feuds with deadly intent. It was a world where reputation and gain could easily overshadow honor, and where rivalries once reignited were often settled with sharp steel regardless of the rules. Frequent injuries were not an exception, but an expectation. Dislocated shoulders, shattered wrists, concussions that left you dazed and disoriented for days. You learned the necessity of checking your ears after a particularly vicious blow to the helmet, lest they be ringing for a week. Even spectators were not immune, occasionally struck by flying splinters from shattered lances. A stark reminder that even staged violence carried very real risks. Beyond the lists, a bustling fairground atmosphere enveloped the tournament site. Traders set up their stalls selling everything from questionable relics to roasted chestnuts, their hawking cries filling the air. Scribes eager to capitalize on the excitement would compose exaggerated poems of heroic deeds, their quills scratching furiously. Apprentices, their eyes wide with admiration, would mimic knightly names, dreaming of their own future glory. It was a vibrant sensory overload, a temporary city built around the spectacle of martial prowess. Nightfall brought revelry. Bonfires would crackle, casting long, dancing shadows. Ale would flow freely, often watered down, but still potent enough to loosen tongues and inhibitions. Minstrels, now freed from their formal duties, would gather to exaggerate every blow, every successful pass, every favor granted by a noble lady. These were moments of release, of shared camaraderie, and drunken boasts, a temporary escape from the constant pressure of performance. Noble feasts, however, demanded a different kind of performance. These were not the raucous affairs of the common folk, but carefully choreographed social events full of forced politeness. You would endure conversations about jousting technique, often with veiled interests in inheritance or scandal. Political maneuvering was constant. Alliances were struck in quiet corners. Rivalries flared over perceived slights, and quiet wagers were placed among lords. Wins, you understood, could lead to valuable contracts, new vassalage, or even advantageous engagements. Losses, however, would be remembered a stain on your reputation, a missed opportunity. The tournament was as much a diplomatic stage as it was a proving ground for combat. The high cost of participation was an enduring burden. Entry fees, the constant need for armor, repairs, the care and feeding of your warhorse, even bribes to marshals. These expenses accumulated quickly, potentially leading to significant financial drain. Many knights found themselves taking out loans or even selling off portions of their land to fund their participation, a constant gamble on their skill and luck. Yet there was an undeniable addiction to the thrill. The pulsing roar of the crowd, the sound of your name being cheered, the sheer ability of a good win to achieve what years of diligent border patrol could not, fame, wealth, a change in fortune. This powerful draw kept knights coming back despite the personal toll. Your body became a living ledger of bruises, a testament to the blows absorbed and delivered. Your squire, ever watchful, would work late tending to your injuries while you, the knight, would feign comfort, subtly hiding your aches, your exhaustion, even your fear from those who looked up to you. The silent journey home after a tournament would see your companions bearing visible injuries, limping bruised, but your squires, still enchanted by the show, would not yet understand the true hidden price. Tournaments, you realized, were a means to inscribe one's name in gold, to become a force in motion, shining for all to see a star in a violent theatrical firmament. Beyond the battlefield and the jousting lists, there was another, perhaps more enduring life for the medieval knight, the life of the lord of the manor. When you returned from campaign or tournament, there was no true rest. Instead, you immediately stepped into the complex, often frustrating role of your lord's vassal, a landholder, and the primary enforcer of law and order within your domain. Your estate, however small, demanded as much attention, if not more, than any joust or border skirmish. It was a different kind of thief, subtly, but constantly demanding your focus, draining your resources. To the peasants who worked your land, you were not seen as a glorious warrior, the hero of the ballads. You were the one who demanded grain, who sent bailiffs to collect dues, and who constantly reminded them of your ownership. Their perception was far more pragmatic than heroic. You were the authority, the man whose word was law, and whose decisions directly impacted their daily struggle for survival. Your mornings, instead of being filled with the clang of sword drills, were now consumed with the rustle of ledgers and the droning voice of your steward. He would rattle off figures. The harvest yields the taxes owed, the perpetual list of debts. There was always a shortfall, always a problem. Vanished. Pigs failed crops. Unpaid debts. The solutions you quickly learned invariably involved more paperwork, more decrees, and fewer tangible goods, leaving you with a lingering sense of futility. These were problems that could not be solved with a sword, but required patience and a mind for tedious granular details. And then there were the petty grievances. Peasants would queue outside your hall, their faces etched with the familiar weariness of the poor waiting to air their endless disputes over stray geese, over a wandering cow, over a handful of barley, or even over their children's squabbles. It was a weariness that made you yearn for the relative simplicity of a hail of arrows. At least with arrows, the problem was immediate and clear. These mundane quarrels, however, required patience, a kind of wisdom that was rarely tested on the battlefield. You were expected to dispense swift, decisive justice, nodding, gravely fining recalcitrant villagers, inspecting disputed fences, hoping to achieve some semblance of satisfied quiet. Maintaining order within your own retinue and collecting dues from your tenants were constant tasks. You would often have to handle internal conflicts between your own armed men-at-arms over boundaries or livestock, acting as a firm, even-handed master projecting strength without escalating the situation into outright brawling. Tax collection was a ceaseless process, gathering grain, wool, coin, or goods in kind from your peasantry. You would tally it all, store it, and then forward the appropriate portion to your liege lord. Feudal economics was a brutal, often opaque system. You kept a portion for your own household, and men knowing, or at least suspecting, that much of what you collected vanished into the vast coffers of the church or funded the lavish luxuries of your overlord. Questioning this system was like questioning gravity, pointless and potentially dangerous. Oversight was constant, but contentment often an illusion. You would ride slowly through your fields of barley and flax, speaking to the reeve about shortages and discontent, pretending not to hear the subtle mutters among the peasantry about high rents and your expensive scabbard. You maintained authority less by affection than by aloofness, a necessary distance that bred respect, or at least compliance. Your household and estate maintenance were equally demanding. stocking and guarding the hall, drilling the small garrison of men-at-arms, ensuring the castle walls were maintained constantly, reminding your steward about odd smells emanating from the pantry. These were the mundane yet vital tasks that kept the heart of your domain beating. You also oversaw public displays approving repairs by the blacksmith, cooper, and baker, arranging timber for new constructions, and hosting monthly feasts designed to maintain an illusion of cheer and mutual loyalty among your tenants. These gatherings were as much theater as they were community events designed to reinforce your authority and their place in the hierarchy. Your duties as lord extended to judicial and social matters, weaving you deeply into the fabric of your community's daily life. You found yourself arbitrating marriages, settling disputes over dowries, and approving apprenticeship contracts for the village youth. More grimly, you were the ultimate arbiter of justice. Thieves might lose a finger, poachers might pay in coin or arduous labor, and the gallows, those stark symbols of your authority, stood as a constant reminder of the consequences of lawbreaking. Used sparingly but effectively, they underscored the brutal reality of your power. Your relationship with the church was also a delicate balance. You would contribute to the priest's chapel upkeep, ensuring your piety was visible and avoiding any unfavorable sermons that might stir discontent among your tenants. Piety, you often found, was far easier to express in coin than in actual conduct, a pragmatic truth in a world where appearances held great weight. Internal household management presented its own set of challenges, often less glamorous, but no less demanding than managing a battlefield. You navigated the shifting dynamics of loyalty, incompetence, and outright insubordination among your household staff, the furious cooks perpetually short of ingredients, the stable hands perpetually late, the scandalously friendly chambermaids requiring a practiced, feigned ignorance to avoid domestic upheaval. Your squire, now maturing, remained under your direct tutelage. You corrected forgotten saddle straps, uncleaned swords or boots polished with lard instead of proper oil. Scolding was frequent threats of sending him to a monastery were common, but these were always tempered by genuine praise for improvement. A delicate balance of sternness and encouragement designed to forge him into a capable warrior. And then there was your wife, often an unsung force in the medieval household. Her domain was vast and largely independent, encompassing the sprawling kitchens, the complex hierarchy of servants, and the meticulous accounts of household expenditures. Her sharp wit and terrifying efficiency were often the only things keeping the manor running smoothly, and she would not hesitate to remind you of your duties, or more pointedly, call you out on your failings. She was your partner, your administrator, and often your quiet conscience, a pragmatic mind in a world of men and steel. Managing scarcity and abundance was a constant, unpredictable cycle. When famine struck, as it inevitably did, you were forced into the unenviable role of both judge and beggar. You might reluctantly appeal to your own liege lord for relief rationing supplies among your starving peasantry, knowing that every grain counted. Practical compassion dictated that a starving peasantry ultimately weakened the manor, threatening rebellion and diminishing your future wealth. You learned to offer just enough to keep them working to prevent outright revolt, a delicate balance between survival and control. In times of plenty, however, you would distribute bread and coins often as a form of public theater, a visible display of generosity designed to maintain order and loyalty as much as it was genuine charity. The peasants' perception of you was complex and ambiguous. They called you "my lord," with a mix of respect, resentment, and a resigned acceptance of their lot. You would catch flickers of judgment in their eyes as you rode past judgment for your wealth, for your power, for the burdens you imposed. You were to them protector, tax collector, judge, and executioner, a multifaceted figure embodying both justice and oppression. Hosting visiting knights or minor nobles was a diplomatic tightrope. It was a blend of obligatory hospitality and subtle hostage negotiation, where you had to appear wealthy enough to impress but not so wasteful as to invite envy. You had to project power without being threatening to your peers. A wrong word about taxes, a poorly cooked pigeon, or a clumsy compliment could cause grave offense, potentially leading to feuds or damaged alliances. This was the quiet, constant peril of courtly life, a different kind of battle fought with words and social graces. Amidst the constant clamor of duty and the pervasive presence of others, true moments of peace were rare and rest elusive. Despite the demanding nature of your daily responsibilities, deep dreamless slumber was a luxury often negotiated, a comfort intermittent at best. Your bed, a simple wooden frame with a straw or wool mattress, often smelled of dust and fatigue. You might share it with your spouse or on campaign simply with your armor leaning against it in a tent. Sleep was often broken, waking in shifts for prayers, for patrols of the castle walls, or due to the persistent ache of old wounds, those silent companions of a knight's life. You might be summoned for a barracks dispute among your men-at-arms, or lie awake replaying past failures, strategizing for future conflicts, your mind unable to quiet itself even in the dark. The great hall was the hub of your domestic life, serving as lounge, dining room, and even theater. Minstrels and bards, when available, would fill the evenings with their songs, tales of distant wars, of tragic loves, of mythical beasts. These familiar stories provided their own kind of comfort, a repetitive, soothing rhythm that allowed your mind to drift. Games were played by the flickering hearthlight, dice, chess, backgammon. Occasional cheating or grand losses blamed on the poor lighting added a touch of predictable human drama. Feasts, though not the elaborate royal banquets of legend, were nonetheless rowdy affairs, full of noise. The rich smell of roast meat, the inevitable spills of ale and echoing laughter that bounced off the stone walls. You would sit at the high table, a figure of authority, but always close enough to the hearth to feel its warmth, toasting your men and your squire, throwing bones to the expectant hounds that lay at your feet. Jugglers or fools, their thinly veiled insults, often the sharpest wit you'd hear, would perform their antics, creating pockets of genuine, if often coarse, laughter. This fragile peace, maintained by roast pork and stale bread, was a vital counterpoint to the rigors of your public life. Quieter evenings, however, offered a glimpse into a different kind of reality. A servant might play a lute, its melancholic notes filling the hall. Your wife would sit perhaps embroidering by the fire, her needles clicking softly. You, the knight, might find yourself nodding off by the hearth, waking with a start to the sound of collapsing logs, the warmth slowly fading. The household would retire early, servants vanishing to their straw pallets, your squire lingering for a final word of praise or advice before returning to his own meager sleeping place. For you, midnight wanderings were common, a residual habit from old campaigns. You'd find yourself checking locks, peering into the shadows of the dimly lit castle, listening for anything amiss. It was a need to move to feel the reassuring solidity of the stone floor beneath your feet, a constant low-level vigilance that never truly ceased. Even storms with their howling winds and driving rain could make sleep nearly impossible, reminding you of exposed nights spent in the field of the vulnerability you had faced. Yet even in that discomfort, you would acknowledge with a quiet sigh that this was better. This, at least, was shelter. Intrusive private thoughts were your most challenging opponents. Managing the inner landscape of your mind proved harder than managing fields or squires. doubts about the permanence of your land, the fleeting nature of your authority would gnaw at you. The faces of men you had killed, some remembered vividly, some only as fleeting blurs, would flash through your mind. You'd wonder if your own father, that stern, unyielding figure, felt the same pull between duty and doubt, the same quiet anxieties. Perhaps in a rare moment of indulgence you might scratch out letters, draft notes, even attempt terrible poetry works that your steward would politely tolerate, and your wife would discreetly hide, acknowledging your brief failed forays into artistry. Your private life, you quickly learned, tended to vanish the moment guests arrived. Every aspect of the hall transformed into a performance. The hall would be meticulously cleaned, the best wine brought out, and conversations would be punctuated by forced laughter and the endured retelling of old familiar stories. It was a tiring charade demanding a level of social energy that often eclipsed the physical demands of battle. The rarest indulgence you allowed yourself was after the guests finally departed. Then, and only then, would you permit yourself silence. You would sit by the fire, letting the hush stretch free from the demands of battles, the complexities of taxes, or the intricate dance of courtly manners. These were the true moments of peace, the ones you rarely spoke of. Your body became a living ledger, each ache and complaint a map of past encounters. You knew precisely which shoulder clicked with a dull throb, which ribs ached from an old forgotten fall. You greeted these familiar pains like old comrades, their presence a constant reminder of the life you had chosen. You learned not to complain, to simply acknowledge the discomfort and move on. And when your squire, out of genuine concern, asked if you had slept well, you would kindly but firmly lie, reassuring him, and perhaps yourself, that all was well. Yet your dreams would remain vivid, persistent flashes of battle, of crumbling childhood homes, even sometimes of the impossible sensation of flying. These memories, etched into your subconscious, were often sharper than your blade. The mundane details of daily life, you discovered, filled the vast stretches of time between swords and steel. Mud tracked into the hall a loose floorboard that needed attention, a spilled bucket of water, a burnt loaf of bread from the kitchen, a persistent cough in the night from one of the servants. These were the small, unremarkable realities that grounded your existence. Even on feast days, the public and private aspects of your life would blend. You might find yourself pulled into circles of dancing, more observing than participating, laughing at your own stiff footwork, the servants subtly smiling at your awkward attempts. Simple acts of kindness, too, filled these quiet moments, giving small gifts of bread or cheese to a struggling family or a few coins to a beggar. You observed life unfolding around you, children chasing each other in the courtyard, their shouts echoing off the stone walls, elders sitting in the sun, their faces weathered maps of long lives. These brief afternoons, unburdened by taxes or the need for judgment, offered a quiet grace. You would scratch your dog's ears, his head resting heavily on your lap, and feel your shoulders sink with a quiet gratitude. You were tired, yes, but with a deeper ache, the ache of carrying purpose, of upholding a system, of holding a world together. This routine, this rhythm of mundane tasks, public duties, and private reflections, was where you found a stubborn peace, something closer to meaning than comfort. The true story of the night, you realized, was not the chronicles of grand battles or the embellished tales of the bards. It was in these quiet hours, in the half-forgotten songs humming in your mind, in the unfinished letters on your desk, in the hushed silence of a sleeping hall. These were the moments that truly told who you were, revealing the man beneath the armor, the complexities of a life dedicated to a brutal yet often noble ideal. This was the unseen, unwritten legacy of the knight. The lofty ideals of chivalry, as you had been taught, were meant to be the shining noble creed that defined knighthood. The very word itself, chivalry, sparkled like polished armor in the morning sun, evoking images of honor, courage, and virtue. It outlined the core virtues: bravery in the face of danger, courtesy even towards enemies, unwavering honor, fierce protection of the weak, and profound reverence for the church. It was a lofty ideal written in elegant scripts, praised endlessly from pulpits, and by the lyrical verses of poets, a beautiful tapestry woven from the highest human aspirations. These theoretical foundations established chivalry as a moral compass, a code of conduct deeply rooted in Christian values and an unshakable feudal loyalty. It began in many ways as an ambitious attempt by the Church to temper the brutal realities of medieval warfare, to transform knights from mere hired blades, from instruments of pure violence, into holy defenders. They were to fight rightly, to use their formidable power in service of God and order, not merely for personal gain or conquest. While official guidelines differed among chroniclers and clerics, evolving with time and geography, certain consistent themes resonated through all interpretations. The protection of the innocent was paramount, a sacred duty. The defense of the Church, its lands, and its teachings was a non-negotiable obligation. Unwavering loyal service to one's Lord, no matter the personal cost, was a cornerstone. Mercy was to be shown to yielding foes, a stark contrast to the common practice of ruthless slaughter. Honesty was encouraged, though often selectively applied, and the avoidance of unjust wars, however defined, was a theoretical ideal. And of course, honor towards women, especially noble women, was a frequently emphasized tenet, though its practical application was often narrow and conditional. However, as a knight, you quickly learned the inconvenient truths of chivalry in practice. That grand tapestry of ideals, so beautiful at a distance, began to fray up close, especially when confronted with the brutal reality of your first battle. There you quickly discovered the code was more of a suggestion than an unbreakable rule. In the chaos and terror of combat, there was simply no time for abstract virtues. It was about swinging your blade, about surviving, about following orders, even if those orders meant torching innocent villages for their lord's disloyalty, an act directly contrary to the ideals of protection. Mercy too often had a market value. Prisoners were taken not out of a noble desire to spare life, but primarily for ransom. A captured knight, if valuable, was spared the sword only because his family could pay a hefty price for his return. This transactional mercy was far removed from the pure, selfless ideal, and honesty, while encouraged, often proved flexible. It was embraced unless deception better served your lord's interests. Lies you learned could easily be wrapped in noble language disguised as strategic necessity or vital intelligence gathering, making them palatable, even admirable in the eyes of your superiors. The concept of protecting the weak while sounding lovely in songs often yielded to the harsh realities of collateral damage in the field. Poetic ideals collided with practical necessities. If commanded, you would ride to crush peasant revolts, your armored fist striking down the very people you were theoretically sworn to protect. If commoners blocked a path to an enemy's vital grain supply, you would move through them rather than around their lives, secondary to the strategic objective. The poor you knew admired knights from afar, viewing them as symbols of power and authority, but rarely, if ever, were they better off after a night's passage. Their lives were simply an unfortunate byproduct of the ambitions of their lords. The perception of women, often idealized in courtly love poetry, frequently clashed with the pragmatic realities of the medieval world. Relationships with women for a knight were defined more by legal status and property law than by flowery sentiment. Romance, when it existed, was often fleeting secondary to the more pressing concerns of lineage alliance and inheritance. Protection, too, was heavily dependent on a woman's class. A noblewoman might be revered, her honor fiercely defended, while a washerwoman caught in the path of war held little value and received far less consideration. Chivalry, in this regard, was often a very selective virtue, applied where it was convenient or politically advantageous. Unrewarded restraint was another hard truth. Many knights, perhaps even yourself, genuinely attempted to live by the code to embody its highest principles. You would pray, you would tithe to the church, you would conscientiously try to avoid cruelty. But the harsh reality of the world rarely rewarded such restraint. On the battlefield, hesitation, a moment of moral deliberation, could mean your own death. In court, plain truth-telling, especially if it was inconvenient, could mean the loss of your land, your reputation, or even your head. The world you discovered often favored the ruthless, the cunning, the pragmatic over the purely honorable. Tournaments, however, became the primary stage where chivalry could truly shine, where its rigid rules and the concept of real honor could be seen in staged spectacles. Here you could perform the virtues, saluting your opponent, before a joust, showing restraint, losing with grace. It was a theatrical space, a carefully controlled environment, where the code briefly became reality, where the performance of nobility was paramount. In the lists, you could be the knight of the bard's songs, the embodiment of the ideal, even if the reality outside those wooden barriers was far more complex. Manuals on knightly conduct, often detailed and prescriptive, offered guidance. They instructed on how not to strike a disarmed foe, a noble sentiment that was often forgotten in the heat of battle. They might even dictate the proper way to retrieve a lady's dropped glove without staring at her ankles. A small humorous detail in a world of much larger brutalities. Church dictates, meanwhile, focused on piety, regular mass attendance, frequent confession, avoidance of gluttony and other sins. They emphasized the Church's divine sanction for their right to kill, a spiritual justification for their violent profession. Different noble households, you observed, interpreted the code uniquely. Some emphasized unwavering loyalty above all else, disowning any knight who showed even a hint of cowardice. Others prioritized ferocity in battle, rewarding brutal efficiency over gentle mercy. Some would knight a man for a strategic marriage alliance, others only for proven valor on the field. Chivalry, then, was less a monolithic, unyielding law and more a mirror reflecting the values and necessities of the lord who enforced it. Some polished it daily, striving for its gleaming perfection. Others shattered it for convenience, only to hastily glue the pieces back together for public display. Yet despite these pervasive contradictions and the often cynical application of the code, a knight could and often did strive to make it a personal compass, a guide for small decisions and quiet acts of persistence. You might personally attempt to adhere to the spirit of the code, helping your squire unseen with a particularly difficult task, sparing a yielding enemy when no one else was looking, or escorting a limping peasant out of the path of a raiding party, simply because a child's plea had touched your hardened heart. These were the unsung acts, the quiet, sacred moments that stayed with you far longer than any grand victory. Yet they were never sung by bards. Chivalry, you realized, was not about grand public gestures, but about the small choices made when no one was looking, when there was no audience, no reward, just the quiet satisfaction of upholding a personal standard. It was about choosing to be decent, even in a profession built entirely around destruction. You were by your very nature and training a weapon, an instrument of violence. But chivalry offered you the possibility of sometimes choosing not to strike, of pausing, of finding a moment of restraint in a world that constantly demanded ruthlessness. This was the quiet internal battle, far more challenging than any external one. You learned to navigate the inherent tensions and contradictions of your life. One day, you might kneel before a bishop receiving a blessing pledging your soul to God. The next, you might be torturing a granary forcing its secrets from the lips of a terrified peasant. You might cradle a wounded comrade offering comfort and care, and then moments later ruthlessly trample a fleeing footman who stood between you and your objective. You signed pledges of honor and restraint, only to then sign orders that sent starving men to their deaths. The code, you realized, was not a shield against getting lost, but rather something to check a compass to consult when the fog of war or the demands of your lord set in. It was a constant reminder of your intended self, a counterpoint to the brutal logistics of survival. You would also over time learn to recognize when chivalry was being weaponized, when fellow knights would quote scripture while pillaging a village preaching honor but practicing terror. You would identify them by their polished crests and their empty eyes, the hollowness of their claims, a stark contrast to their brutal actions. And in rare moments of quiet defiance, you might choose to step aside to refuse to participate, or very rarely to stand in their way even if it meant risking your own standing. This was the ultimate dangerous act of personal chivalry. Persistence through imperfection became the true measure of the code. You would acknowledge your own failings, times you had broken the code, struck a surrendered man, taken spoils that were not your due, or stayed silent when you should have spoken. But you would also draw strength from those who truly tried, the knight who held a gate for a defenseless village, the man who refused to burn a monastery, the one who died in prayer rather than yield to despair. This quiet striving, this daily effort, was the essence of your commitment. You carried the code not in scripture, but in habit, picking it up like a sword each morning, knowing it might slip, but reaching for it anyway. The code offered the possibility of being something more than merely a killer, of finding a shred of nobility in a brutal profession. And finally, you would consider the passing of this legacy. You still rode, still defended your lord, still fought enemies, still buried the dead. But you also fed your squire, spoke kindly to villagers, and returned, dropped gloves unseen. You taught persistence not by reciting scripture, but by handing a sword to a boy one evening and asking if he could carry it without letting it fall on the wrong soul. That you thought was a good place to start. Chivalry, you understood, was less about perfection and more about persistence, about falling short and rising again quietly, choosing not to become what one was sworn to fight. With each choice, each small act of conscience, you would draw the sword straighter, knowing that your identity, shaped by steel, was ultimately defined by these quiet moral choices. As the centuries turned, a new rhythm began to seep into the very foundations of the knight's world, signaling a profound shift. The aching dawn for the aging knight brought with it not just the familiar stiffening of joints, but a cold that seemed to seep deeper into the very bones, a chill that was more than just physical. There were fewer hooves on the road, fewer formal salutes from passing travelers. The knight, once the very emblem of military might and societal order, found his banners hanging lower, his once essential role now feeling purely symbolic, a relic of a fading age. A new future was emerging, one shaped by forces beyond the knight's understanding or control. Young lads, those with fire in their eyes and dreams of glory, no longer looked solely to the night as their ideal. Their gaze was shifting, drawn instead to engineers with strange, complex machines, or to captains drilling their pike and gunpowder men into new, terrifying formations. The world was changing, and the knight, for all his strength and skill, was slowly being left behind. The musket, for instance. The first time you witnessed one fired in anger, it would have been a shock to your very core. There was no nobility in it, no personal combat, just a sudden deafening bang, a cloud of acrid smoke, and then inexplicably a man down. It was a cold, impersonal death, utterly devoid of the honor and individual struggle you had been trained for. You might clean your sword afterwards out of habit or sheer defiance, but you would know deep down that its time was slowly, irrevocably passing. This forced you into a slow, often painful acknowledgement of obsolescence. The summons from your lord, once calls to arms or to important councils of war, now requested grain tallies, tax rolls, tenant reports. Instead of preparing for border skirmishes, you found yourself immersed in the tedious realities of estate management. The new leaders of battle were men with maps and strategies, not men in mail. Your presence on the battlefield became a formality, your counsel a polite tradition no longer vital. At court, too, the presence of the great knights, the renowned warriors of your youth, became less frequent. Old names once whispered with awe began to disappear from conversation, replaced by the names of merchants, lawyers, and administrators. Your polished armor, once a symbol of active power, began to gather dust in the armory, each dent and rivet a painful, silent reminder of a life now slowly fading into myth. And in the rare instances you wore it for ceremony, you might overhear a young boy, completely unafraid, call it old-fashioned, a statement of innocent observation that you would no longer correct. The world was moving on. Cracks began to appear in the very pageantry of your existence. Feasts grew quieter, attended by fewer nobles, the heralds proclaiming their titles with less gusto. The songs which once praised knights for their current deeds now only spoke of them in the past tense. The tenantry, the very bedrock of your power, was also changing. Farmers were using newer, more efficient tools, carrying the king's coins, clutching paper permits. The blacksmith's son talked of wanting to be a clerk in the city. The miller's daughter spoke of schooling and new opportunities. You, the knight, would experience a profound internal conflict. You acknowledged these changes as good things, signs of progress, of a more ordered, prosperous world. Yet deep inside you would feel the insidious whisper that you were no longer what boys aspired to be. The hero of a bygone age, a relic in a rapidly evolving world. The physical and mental strain of belonging to a bygone era settled deep within your aging body. Your shoulder, long accustomed to the weight of a shield and the shock of impact, now stiffened with a dull ache. Your breath, once capable of sustained exertion, shortened on uphill rides, a gentle but insistent reminder of limits. Even your blade, the very extension of your arm, began to feel longer, heavier, more unwieldy. Your squire, now a grown man, would look at you with a mixture of profound respect and quiet readiness. His gaze a mirror reflecting your own past, a vivid image of the vigor you once possessed. Your combat role, too, was irrevocably altered. No longer would you be in the vanguard leading the thunderous charge into the heart of the enemy. Instead, you would be asked to observe and advise, a position of wisdom over action, appreciated for your experience, but quietly aching to charge, to feel the familiar surge of adrenaline, to be in the thick of it once more. You understood with a profound sense of finality that the age of the night was ending, not with a glorious roar, but with a slow, mournful sigh. Gunpowder you recognized was utterly indifferent to bloodlines, to honor, to the meticulous formations of chivalry. A charge once a terrifying display of disciplined might was now simply a target, a mass of vulnerable flesh and steel. There was grief in this acceptance, a quiet sorrow for what was lost, but also a residual pride. You acknowledged with a stoic acceptance that every age must end much like the great Roman roads that now crumbled into dust, or the ancient emperors whose names were fading even from memory. This quiet grief was felt in small, poignant moments when your meticulously maintained sword drew mere curiosity from a visitor, not admiration for its honed edge. When your family banner, once recognized for its victories, was now acknowledged only for its longevity. When your noble war horse was quietly replaced by a practical mule for your daily rounds. Yet despite this melancholy, you counted yourself profoundly lucky to have lived to have been part of such a transformative age. You had seen the best and the worst of your order endured its brutal tests, earned your land and your name, and miraculously made it home. This was a form of triumph in itself, a testament to sheer persistence. In the stillness, reflections would often come. You might visit old battlefields, now transformed into peaceful farmland, the echoes of chaos replaced by the rustle of crops. You would dismount to walk your boots, sinking into the soft earth that had once drunk so much blood. Perhaps you'd find a weathered marker stone, its names long forgotten by others, but remembered vividly by you, each name a ghost in the wind. Your dreams, too, became more frequent, not always nightmares, but vivid flashes of past moments, the shattering impact of a lance, the booming laugh of a lost comrade, the exact sky over a foreign field, the precise angle of a sword swing. These memories etched into your subconscious were often sharper than your blade. In rare moments, you might attempt to write these reflections down, no longer orders or decrees, but attempts to capture the truth of knighthood, the weight of armor, the pre-tilt tension of a joust, the smell of rain before battle, the quiet camaraderie of the camp. You wrote for an unknown future reader, a silent testimony to a life lived. When visitors came asking questions about glory and honor, you would offer careful responses, acknowledging that it was cold, loud, lonely, but a service to your lord, your land, and an ideal that sometimes felt greater than any one man. One evening you might hand your sword to your grown squire, a quiet, unspoken transfer of legacy. He was the future, and in his capable grip, you saw the continuation of a tradition, even if its form was changing. As he took it, you would allow the honorific Sir to echo not just as a title, but as a recognition of your enduring role, a memory of what had been, and a whisper of what still might be. The fading of your age was a slow, inexorable rhythm. The halls grew quieter. The hearth fire burned lower. Your duties lessened. But the land and its people continued adapting, enduring. In this newfound stillness, you found a sense of quiet fulfillment, a stubborn peace that was hard won. The true knighthood you finally understood was not the bard's songs or the painter's idealized images. It was the cold mornings, the crooked smiles shared with your men, the cracked ribs and gallows humor, the wet horse beneath you, the cheap ale in a rough tavern. That you realized was enough. The future remained uncertain. You knew castles would crumble, cannons would roar, old ways would be folded into new, unrecognizable forms. But you hoped perhaps that a child centuries from now might still point to a battered figure on a tapestry, and that someone somewhere would remember the man who had lived, fought, and endured. The echoes of the past now begin to soften, fading gently into the quiet of your present. The clatter of armor, the distant shouts of the battlefield, the murmur of the medieval hall, let them all recede like a tide pulling back from a peaceful shore. Imagine the knights so burdened by duty and the weight of their steel now finding their own measure of peace, perhaps in the quiet of a settled manor, or in the stillness of a well-earned rest. Their hardships, their constant vigilance, their lives lived on the cusp of danger, are a stark contrast to the soft bed beneath you, the quiet hum of modern comforts, the simple luxury of unbroken sleep. There are no cold stone floors here, no rattling of swords in the dark, only the comforting embrace of your own sanctuary. As you drift, let the last images be of quiet strength of perseverance, not of conflict. The stories have been told, the journey complete. There is nothing left to do now but surrender to the gentle pull of slumber. All is well.